Dr. Shankar has joined.
I'm here.
Yes, thank you, sir. So burns is the very common and occasional situation in children, infants, and everybody who is in care of children should know about this, the first aid and the expert management. We are having a expert person on this topic. I request Dr. Srinivasan sir to start his talk. Thank you.
Good morning. I last remember when I delivered this lecture physically to this group of eminent postgraduates. It was in the same hall, and this hall was full with about maybe 50, 60 young minds. Well, today, your heart lurches when you see an empty auditorium, well, almost empty. But well, these are trying times, and I think we're going to have a lot of technical glitches today because it's the weekend. Our IT people have not come, and I'm supposed to be the Vadia stand-up comic here, in the sense that I have been sitting through a few of your lectures, and I see this intense discussions happening. Hypersplenism. Yesterday I was here for this hydrocephalus and meningomyelocele thing, so I thought I should make it a little light and nice for all of you. When this topic, this is like, मैं रास्ते से जा रहा था, मैं बेलपुर, and they were suddenly yanked into this, oh, you have to talk on burns kind of thing. And like just as I was getting ready to, have a nice meal, and, they suddenly say, no, you're only been given 15 minutes. It's like, it's a huge tragedy being heaped upon me. But I'm going to make light of it. So just have a good time. Actually, I wanted to speak about the effect of demonetization versus lockdown on upsurge in the population of pediatric patients. But then Prajna Bendre told me, dare you deviate from the topic, just talk on what you have been asked to talk about. So I'll just come back to the topic now. So it'll be like a nice fluffy omelette, nice and light, but nutritious at the same time. Okay, I think all human problems started with Adam, Eve, the apple, and the serpent. So I will not go back to when fire was invented, how it came, how it burnt up all of us. But coming to recent times, I'm sure there are many in the audience who will probably hark back to my times when we had this तेरे मेरे बीच में कैसा है ये बंधन अनजाना. So this Kamal Hassan and Rati Agnihotri permanently imprinted in my mind. And these were my Chennai days, and every roadside Romeo was singing this song. And after that, at Kilpauk Medical College and Dr. Matangi Ramakrishnan's unit, we had number of burn patients who came in. So just to tell you that how Lord Cupid with his, bow and arrow, eventually, he smits, or we are all smitten, and at the end of it, you get burnt also. All of them are somehow bought for admission, etc., on spread over banana leaves. I think it's really available in plenty in the south. And I've still to get over the smell of burnt flesh mingled with the flavor of banana leaves. So when Dr. Bendre and the organizers told me to talk on this, like with anything else, I wanted to identify the target audience. So when I asked a few people, means tum log burns padhte ho kya for pediatric surgery? So somebody looked at me and said, burns? It's as if I'd asked them, list the features of Casanur forest disease or, Rocky Mountain spotted fever or some such thing. So then I told myself, let's not make this very high profile and something for plastic surgeons and, the latest advances. Let's adopt the KISS principle for this lecture, which means keep it short and simple, stupid. So that stupid is for me. So like the budget speech, if you've seen our eminent finance ministers delivering it, there's going to be a lot of knowledge, information, insight, a little shero shairi, that type of thing. I will assume that when pediatric surgeons sit for the exam, the theory exam, at the max to max, you'll be asked a short note on discuss burns or something like that. So this is akin to a little boy going for the exam, not very well prepared, and they say write an essay on cow, गाय. So this little boy writes, गाय हमारी माता है, आगे कुछ नहीं आता है. So the examiner in turn retorts, बैल हमारा बाप है, marks देना पाप है. So at the end of this discussion, I'm sure you will not be in the place of that child who has to go and say, I don't know anything about burns. I mean, I'm sure even without this enlightening lecture, you'll be all able to write a short note and you'll get 3 out of 5. But I'll just make this journey a little light and nice. Okay. Lord Google gives us lot of knowledge. I really don't have to go through all this. When I gave the presentation to Dr. Gayatri, she said 60 slides. So I immediately told myself, no, Gayatri, it's going to be like maybe 5-6 slides. So basically, just to know burn is an injury, you have to start your short note nicely, right? You have to catch the eyeballs of the examiner. So it's an injury characterized by coagulative necrosis of tissue, etc., etc. Come down. Two extrinsic factors very important: the intensity of heat and how long that object has been in contact with the skin. But if you remember this much, done. This is just to tell you that I've spent a lot of time making this presentation, trying to sound knowledgeable. Fine. So when this child comes to you in casualty or in your practice, I mean, sometimes I get questions from pediatricians, pediatric surgeons, general surgeons. अरे ये बच्चा को ऐसा burn हुआ है, how do you go about treating? पहला क्या करना है? Dressing कैसा करना है? So you just imagine yourself doing that. I mean, I could have started and ended this lectures having given you my mobile number saying, ऐसा आपके पास burns patient आएगा, please refer to Wadia Children's Hospital. This is my mobile number. So I'm just giving you a small snapshot on what you should be doing. You will definitely get 1 out of 2 marks if you say that, the charting is very important. So please initially arrive at how much percentage of the body has been burned, total body surface area of burns. Gold standard Wallace's rules of 9, but for children specifically, please quote London Browder charting. Very important. Okay. If you've estimated the percentage of body burnt, next question will be the burn depth. So this chart, I mean, I'm sure all this is getting recorded. You'll be able to archive it. You'll be able to see it. So I'm not going to read everything. It's just to show you that burn depth is equally important. First day, first show, child in casualty, relatives always ask, Doctor, बहुत deep जला है क्या? And after you sort of look at them quizzically, the next question they'll ask you is, ये सब होने के बाद दाग रह जाएगा क्या? Very difficult to answer these questions first day. Just a few representative pictures. Superficial burns, all of us want to see these firangs, these nice white people lying on the beach getting a sunburn. We'll never have it in India, never ever. So this is one more in the realms of imagination. Now, why I put this picture is this is what we get usually. You get these children, cute little things with these horrendous looking blisters on the back. Look awful. The mother always says, "मेरा चांद जैसा बच्चा देखो कितना अभी horrible दिख रहा है." For us, it is excellent news. When you see blisters, it sort of tells you that the burns are not very deep. Okay? One take-home message. There are many such take-home messages. So that was a superficial partial thickness burn. We now have what is a deep partial thickness burn. Okay? You can look at it and you know that they're different. This is a full thickness burn. Mixed. See, rarely do you have clear demarcations. अभी ये first degree है, ये second. It's very difficult. So you normally have a mixed picture. What causes burns? Anything can cause burns. Okay, you have hot burns, you have cold burns, you have frostbite. Anything in the world can cause a burn. If there are people who are paying attention, somebody please remind me about, I'll tell you 2 things you can remind me about. One is this Ryle's tube in the nose. I'll tell you the second thing you can remind me about. Electrical burn, acid burns. I mean, it just goes on and on. Okay. Treat a burn like you have this advanced trauma life support system. Treat it along those lines. Okay. One more take-home message, please pour water on burns. Please pour water on burns. I cannot emphasize this enough because of all the things water does. Question being, how much water to pour? So just keep your hand under running water or let water be poured on the burnt area till the pain disappears. That may take 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So just cool the skin. Okay. The second thing the audience can remind me about is the use of that fan there by the side of the patient. Normally we have patients saying, doctor, हमको AC room चाहिए, बच्चा comfortable रहेगा. No, that's a myth. The correct temperature would be about 25, 26 degrees, and you don't require an AC environment for burns to heal. So please remind me about the Riles tube and the fan. I'll try to remember too. There was this great thing about wrap this burning person in a blanket and make him roll. No, not anymore. Fine. There was a nice Campa Cola ad which said we are all in it together for the fun of it. So it's a huge team effort. When you say we are all in it together, the list is long. You have the doctors, you have the surgeon, you have the intensive care specialists, you have, the dresser mamas, so many people. We are fortunate in our institute to have a world-class setup. The burns unit is very, very simple. Now, when I say world-class setup, I mean an excellent ICU. So our initial hitches, like this putting the line, getting a central line, this electrolyte management, whether it is hot shock, cold shock, burn syndrome, I don't understand these things. I'm very, very, in fact, I would be very happy to tell you that the initial 48, 72 hours of burns is entirely medical. I'll be crucified by my surgical colleagues, but this is a fact. You must have excellent pediatricians, intensive care specialists who will take care of all this nitty gritty. It's beyond me to know hyponatremia hai, how much conch RL is. It's not my cup of tea. It's nobody's cup of tea. So one more take home message. What do you do? Now you see you're in your practice. I would say these small burns, please treat. Major burns, please refer. It all depends on the caliber of the person treating. What do you do with these blisters? The largest organ in the body is skin. It was skin till somebody told me, sir, abhi wo din paper mein aaya tha, the largest organ in the body is the interstitium. It was a revelation to me. So for now, we'll keep it as skin. The best dressing still remains skin. So you can always de-roof the blisters if you so feel, but please don't take off the skin. It's a biological dressing, right? So let it just go back and settle on the burn area, as we have shown you in the picture on the right. Okay, do you need to de-roof the blisters? You don't need to de-roof the blisters. Okay, unless it's interfering with joint movement, or if you feel that the fluid inside is looking turbid, etc. One more mark you will get in your short note if you mention this zones of injury. So you have this Jackson zone where he said the central zone, that's the zone of coagulation. As I already said, coagulation necrosis. The zone outside in stippled pink is the zone of stasis. Now that is the dynamic zone. Why dynamic? Because if you get the patient early, if you treat him with IV fluids, if you do a proper dressing, this zone can very well be converted into the zone of the third zone, the zone of hyperemia. The zone of hyperemia is going to heal, whether you do anything or you don't do anything. It's this response of the skin to this intense cytokines and interleukins, etc., which have flooded the circulation following the burn. So the hyperemic zone, the one in red, is going to heal. The dynamic zone is the zone of stasis, the pink one. So with your intervention, that is where our intervention comes. So with your intervention, you can prevent that zone from getting converted into the zone of coagulation. The coagulated zone is a dead zone. Look at it as myocardial tissue. Once dead, permanently dead. You have to just get rid of it at some point. Okay, done. I have one monitor here who's like gently rapping me on the knuckles. Fine. So like this little magician with this bag of tricks, I'll now move on to what I want to tell you in your practice. How do you, will you do an open dressing? Will you do a closed dressing? Since times immemorial, this battle is being fought. I don't think we're ever going to see the end of it. I'm specifically showing this slide to just tell you that plastic surgeons are the greatest dressers, and the next day we become the greatest undressers also. How? Now you have an area which has been burned. Let us assume you have a... This can't become bigger. Like I want to show his hand. Will they say? As you can see, I'm extremely tech challenged. Fine. So I have Yogesh's hand here. Can you see, guys? His hand?
Yes.
Okay. Please somebody say yes, as it's such an unreal feeling sitting here and just talking to the screen.
Yes. Yes. I can see.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, they're getting blown up now. No. Okay. So assuming he has a burnt area here, please
Yes.
do a small exercise at home. All of you just put your hand on the cooker and just get a small burn. See how painful it is. So how do you dress this area? You dress this, the first thing you want something which is not going to stick. So there are attributes of burn dressing where you say it has to be cheap, easily available, affordable. It should not be toxic. It should not be antigenic. It should relieve pain. It should be moisture retaining. Few attributes. So we have also gone through our process of evolution. So when we started off burns dressings, we started off with something called the boiled potato peel. Ajiz, are you able? It's
Yes. Yes.
potato peel, yes, which has it's really potato peel. Fine. So we moved on from that because it became very laborious to manufacture this. I mean, you take a bandage, this thing, then you go to KEM hospital, get all those potato peels here, then you put a maida base on the gauze, then you stick them, autoclave them. So the mama was just doing this the whole day. We graduated. Eventually, we came to something called Tina Bed. All of you are of, and we call this TENA
Yes.
company. Yeah, so underpad, if you would know it. So what we do is, and now see, I was also told that please don't have personal anecdotes and backslapping. I'm not doing any such thing. This is published. So we cut a portion of the Tina bed like this. This has a cotton side and it has a plastic side. So one patient asked me, "आप plastic लगाते हो क्योंकि आप plastic surgeon हो?" I said, "Yes, bingo." So we cut this according to the shape of the burn. Go a little beyond the margin. It's not cut to cut. Apply the ointment. I mean, 1% silver sulfadizine still is the gold standard. Apply the ointment on the plastic side. This is like buttering up the bread, okay? And apply the plastic side on the burnt area. It seems strange. It doesn't fit in with anything you've learned in the past 5, 6, 7, 8, 20, 30, 40 years. But just try it before you junk it. Okay? How do you retain this in place? Now, this is going to be moisture retaining. It's definitely going to leak. Patients get very, very upset. I mean, जख्म अच्छा सूख रहा था, ये डॉक्टर के पास गया, कुछ तो किया, अभी एकदम गिला हो गया. Moist wounds are good wounds. One more take-home message: please keep wounds moist. Now, being plastic, it's going to retain moisture, but being plastic, it's going to slip. So, which answers the question: next day when you take this child for dressing, plastic surgeons become the greatest undressers because this whole thing will just fall. You don't need anesthesia. We live in a world which is an EMI world. All of us need that EMI, but you don't have to adopt practices which are not okay. Okay, the child is anyway. The little monster is going to cry. Come what? It's separation anxiety. He's scared that you're going to do something to it. But after a couple of dressings, he understands that it's not going to be painful. He will cooperate. Okay. Repeat. Ointment on the plastic side. Apply it. How do you secure this? It's going to keep slipping all the time, and this child is going to be moving all the time. So, on top of that, so we bring Ram Teri Ganga Maili into this. You know, like this bathing under the waterfall. So all bandages we wet our ordinary 6-inch bandages, and the first layer you could put some gauze pieces, whatever, and wrap this moist wet bandage around this. So that holds it in place to a large extent. To be doubly sure that you don't get this 12 a.m. call saying doctor dressing slip ho gaya, the last tool in our armamentarium is the crepe bandage. Multiple purposes, retains the dressing in place. Because of the pressure, plastic surgery works on pressure and massage. Pressure will help, will help the tissues delineate. You will get the margins between the viable tissue and the non-viable tissue. So basically, this is what we function on. Okay, I've given you all the tricks of my trade. I don't know how I will be meeting my EMI requirements the next month. Go down the ones. And one last thing, I mean, there are a lot of surgical options. This is the picture of that boiled potato peel that I alluded to, the picture that I showed you here. Okay? Greatest dressers and the greatest undressers. All this is theory. how much IV fluid to give, Parkland's formula. There are modifications of Parkland's formula. Which IV fluid you give ringer lactate. Again, there are modifications. You have Monafo, who gives sodium chloride, crystalloids, colloids. Another homemade formula, 5 रुपया में आपका काम हो जाएगा. You have multiple fascinating dabbas. Patients are very happy if something comes from the dabba. They say महंगा लिखो डॉक्टर, बहुत अच्छा रहता है patient के लिए. So when you tell them this, they are disappointed. So this is what we call buttermilk diet. The constituents are seen on your screen: curd, egg, banana, sugar. We do all of this in this institute. All of this is published. This is no personal anecdotes here. The beauty of this is it comes as an emulsion. You see that it's churned in that mixie. Since it contains egg, and if you have a Jain patient, substitute coconut oil. This mixture has to be kept in the fridge. That is why I asked you to remind me about that Ryle's tube. So every patient who comes with a significant, let us say beyond 10% body surface area, you put in an infant feeding tube. Residents don't listen. They're very happy putting a Ryle's tube. But we are very, very particular that it's an 8 number or a 10 number infant feeding tube. Very comfortable, patient tolerates it very, very nicely. This emulsion is given at the rate of 1 ml per kg per hour. Step up to 3 ml per kg per hour round the clock. That is where the nursing staff becomes upset, because every hour for her to go and do it becomes difficult. So train the mothers who do it phenomenally. They do it better than anybody else. Few surgical examples. So pour water on burns, best first aid. Thank you. And one last thing before I conclude. If you ever happen to do a skin grafting, how do you dress the donor area? So like this magician with a bag of tricks, I bring out my last trick here. This is called as cellophane paper. Everybody would know it as a plastic sheet. It's cellophane paper, right? So paper is regenerated cellulose. It is cellulose, which has glycerin as a plasticizer. So when you autoclave this, it becomes, hear the sound? So after you've harvested a skin graft, we put this as the first layer. Okay? Advantages of cellophane paper: looks like plastic. It is not plastic, it is paper. When you wet this, it becomes very, very permeable to oxygen and to moisture. So again, to retain this in place, you have the same bandage and you have the same crepe bandage. 24 to 48 hours later, you can remove all the top dressings. The cellophane adheres wonderfully to the donor area. That is where the fan comes in. So why do you have the fan? Once you remove the top dressings, this is still a little moist. How do you know this is cellophane? If you wet it, it just tears. You see the way I just tore it? Try this with plastic. It's not going to tear. So this tells you that this is cellophane. So the next day, you remove all the top dressings. This has stuck down. There's a nice little serum layer beneath that. And when you have the fan blowing on it, the whole thing dries up. It becomes like parchment. And after 14 days, it just drops. So that's it. I hope I have given you a small insight into our little world. Thank you very much. Very grateful.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your experienced hints regarding the management of the burn.
I'm sure there are no questions. The talk has been so enlightening and illuminating. The last time we had this talk, I mean, I was almost given a standing ovation. So if anybody feels like clapping, please do.
Sure, sir.
At least my team is clapping. I mean, isn't that something to be proud of? Thank you so much. Enjoy talking to others.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shankar sir, for this very.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Santosh sir, also for this chairing this session. And with that, we quickly move on to the next topic, which is a very important and a very sensitive topic: child sexual abuse. The speaker for this session is Dr. Meenakshi Bhosle, who is professor and head of the Department Pediatric Surgery, BJ Medical College, Pune. And the session will be chaired by Dr. Shalika Jaiswal, who is Professor Pediatric Surgery at Sion Hospital in Mumbai. Over to you. Good morning, everybody. This session, I'm Dr. Shalika, Professor in Pediatric Surgery.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Yes, ma'am.
Shalika, you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Meenakshi. It's nice.
But I cannot hear the. Shall I start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
It's pleasant to see you on screen. Speak it. It's pleasant to see you on screen, Meenakshi, after a long time. Welcome.
I cannot hear you very clearly from your end, I think, but I am audible. I'll start then. Yeah? Sorry for the technical issues. I think if I'm audible, just let me.
We can hear you. Madam, we can hear you.
Meenakshi, we can hear you.
You can hear and see me?
We can hear and see you very clearly. Please.
Okay, madam, I'll start. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Thank you very much for the cordial invitation to be part of this PGCME at Wadia Hospital, my alma mater. I'll start with the lecture without any delay. I'm supposed to speak on child sexual abuse. You might be wondering, is this topic so important to be included in the postgraduate CME? Should we really learn about it? Well, I hope to clear these doubts at the end of this lecture. This topic came into focus by the first ever survey conducted by Government of India in the year 2007, wherein 12,500 children were interviewed, and this brought in a very alarming fact into focus that almost 53% of Indian children suffer from some form of sexual abuse by the age of 18 years. How do we define child sexual abuse? It is involvement of a child in sexual activity that he or she does not fully comprehend to and for which he is not physically or developmentally ready. And here a child means any person below 18 years of age. What all constitutes child sexual abuse? Touching with sexual intent, forcible kissing, exposing a child to pornographic material, exhibitionism, forcing a child to exhibit, and fondling with the child's genitals. All of these constitute, and finally, rape and sodomy are the most deadly forms. To curb the increasing incidences of child sexual abuse in India, the government gave out a law, formulated a law which was passed in our parliament on 19 June 2012 called the POCSO Act, that is Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, even though the actual implementation of the act started from the next Children's Day. Based on the act, guidelines of the act, the Government of Women and Child Development, the Ministry of Women and Child Development gave out model guidelines which we doctors are supposed to follow while treating the children, and my lecture is based on these guidelines. It was made mandatory by each state governments to implement this act within their territories, and in Maharashtra it comes under the Manodhairya Yojana. The act covers all aspects of child sexual abuse, which we just mentioned, about children, that is penetrative and non-penetrative assault, sexual harassment and pornography, and child trafficking for sexual purposes. This is beyond the purview of a lecture, 15 minutes lecture, so now I'll concentrate on penetrative assault. Mind you, only 1 in 3 of the cases of sexual abuse are disclosed, and 1 in 10 cases is reported, so it is just the tip of the iceberg, what we see today. Based on my experience of over 12 to 13 years of dealing with these cases, I classify these cases coming to our hospital into 3 different categories. This is not given in any textbooks. The first category is there is abuse. Abuse has happened. The parents are aware of that. FIR is lodged with the police, and our job is simple in these cases. Fortunately, they amount to 60 to 70% of the chunk. The third category, the abuse has happened. Parents are aware. The child is in acute agony, and we have to treat these cases as any other accident cases along with additional burden of getting the documentary evidence. Here, FIR may or may not be lodged. If not, we have to do the only 5 to 10% of the chunk. The tricky is the second category. Here, the abuse has happened. The parents are either aware or not aware. The child may not have disclosed it to the parents, and therefore there is no FIR lodged. And the child presents to us in OPD with vague symptoms. And here, sorry, the slides are moving. I'm very sorry for that. And therefore, this case, particular case, may be that of a child sexual abuse. And here, our history taking abilities are put to test. The police come to us with questionnaire like this. While cases of child sexual abuse is we have to consider each and every case of child sexual abuse as an emergency. I'll come to the detail later. We need to reassure the child, support the parents, gain the trust and confidence of authorities. Need to ask certain specific questions while taking the whether following the vein, whether there is any pain in the bottom or the genital area, whether there is blood, and whether there has been an episode of urinary fecal incontinence or constipation both ways. Having done that, we proceed on to the examination. Never jump on to genital examination at the first. The child may have other elements, telltale signs, so we have to proceed for the examination as any other routine pediatric or pediatric surgical case. Record the height and weight of the child because neglect may coexist with abuse. Record any other injuries which the child may have on his body. Whether there are any signs of force or restraint used, and whether there are any signs of sexually transmitted infection, and then proceed on to head to toe examination. And examine the genitals at the last. Both anal and vulval or genital area should be examined in all the cases. This is a case which presented to us with bruises and marks on the scar marks on the neck. We all know that we examine the labia in ARM babies with using labial separation. The same thing is to be used here. The other positions which are commonly used are pro-niches position, lateral sims position, and if one has video colposcope or photocolposcope, that will be a valuable addition. Documenting these injuries is of utmost importance. We document them as if we are recording them on the face of a clock, whether the injury is at 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, or 12 o'clock. Injuries in male children, anal fissure, perianal hematoma, anal spasm. If the abuse is repeated, there may be paculus anus. And finally, most dreadful are the anorectal avulsion injuries. Here you can see the injuries and injuries in the female. The commonest is the perihymenal injuries, the hymenal tear, If the force is little more, it may extend into the posterior fossa. And if the impact is even more, the perineal body may be torn and the vagina and anal opening may become a single canal. And we have treated children like this. So this is to document the injuries in a female children. Look at this case. Here you cannot identify the vagina separately. The anal opening, anterior anal sphincter is torn and the vagina and anus are placed just side by side. She has extensive bilateral lateral vaginal tears. This is a case who had had injuries in the past. The vagina and anal canal are placed close by. The anterior anal sphincter, you cannot make out anything, though posteriorly it is well defined. The child has been colostomized, and this is after anatomical repair of the same child. It comes out beautifully. Another male child with enlarged tonsils and posterior pharyngeal wall inflammation, mind you, we have to consider, now time has come, we have to consider child sexual abuse in a DD of almost everything. And even in case of posterior pharyngitis or tonsillitis, one may have to consider this child was subjected to oral sex. These are the set of investigations which we do in all the children as preliminary thing. If one has this kit ready, that is sexual abuse forensic examination or the safe kit ready at your clinic or your center, it saves valuable time and avoids last minute running around. And I would advocate all the centers to keep this handy. The samples should be collected appropriately, stored properly, and labeled accurately, sealed and signed by the collecting person and handed over to the authorities. This is how the labeling is done on the envelope. The tricky situation here, we have to consider that it may be a sexual abuse, possible sexual abuse, if the child presents to us with vague lower abdominal pain, vaginal discharge, recurrent urinary tract infections, which are unexplained when there is no other anatomical reason to explain that, recurrent vulvovaginitis, urinary or fecal incontinence. In all these cases, we have to have high suspicion and think that whether I'm missing child sexual abuse in this particular case. The child may present with various psychological symptoms in a pediatric OPD or psychiatric OPD. And in these cases also, we need to consider child sexual abuse. Or as I said, the third category, the child may come as an absolute accident victim. And we have to treat the injuries first. The history taking can be done later in these cases. But at the same time, before doing the surgical repair or any manipulation, we have to remember to collect the samples even before painting and draping. This is a child who had anorectal aversion. Examination under anesthesia is required when we think there is possibility of requiring surgical repair. Very uncooperative child, children below 4 years, and speculum examination in a prepubertal girl whenever it is required. But children, we need even the first to form emergency cases because the evidence is lost after 48 to 72 hours. The chances of finding live spermatozoa decrease after 48 hours, and therefore, while we are creating awareness, we come to the hospital as early as possible. We should examine the child and collect samples as early as possible, preferably within first 24 to 48 hours, and they should avoid cleaning the genital area. This is evidence to support the accusation. Treatment should be done with utmost care, and at every step, every point, we must take care that we do not cause any further damage, either by repeating the history, either by not being very gentle while examining the children. We have to be very sensitive while dealing with the children. The minor cases, they can be treated conservatively, local cleaning, antibiotics, analgesics. More severe injuries need surgical repair. And I showed you 1 or 2 slides. The repair can be done, can give best anatomical results. We being surgeon, this is again additional fact for us. If we do the repair within first 24 to 48 hours, because infection has not set in by that time, the tissues don't cut through and the wound heal beautifully. Follow-up, we call them every weekly for the initial 1 month and 3 monthly thereafter. Repeat assessment of sexually transmitted diseases is done at 6 months. So to summarize, the role of a doctor, here a pediatric surgery resident or a pediatric surgeon, would be to have an in-depth understanding of sexual victimization, obtaining the child's medical history and the child's experience in a facilitating, non-judgmental and empathetic manner, meticulously documenting all the details of the history, conducting a detailed examination to diagnose acute and chronic residual trauma and sexually transmitted infections, to collect forensic evidence, formulating a complete and thorough medical report for diagnosis and recommendation, and testifying in the court whenever necessary. We all must remember that if there is suspicion of child sexual abuse, we cannot afford not to know it by this time, and it is legally mandatory for us. It is a legal duty that whosoever has the knowledge that a child may be sexually abused, it need not be confirmed, that you need to inform it to the police. In cases when the parents have not lodged FIR before coming to the hospital, it becomes the duty of the hospital authorities, the treating consultant, to bring it to the notice of the police officials. Otherwise, you are liable for 6 months imprisonment and or fine, and you cannot afford to say, I did not know the law of the land. Section 357C of the Indian Penal Code makes it mandatory that the treatment for this victim should be provided free of cost, and also that ideally female children should be examined by a lady doctor. Why we need to know this? Because children constitute the chunk of our patients. Nowadays, the family physicians are almost extinct. Pediatricians are busy treating children with medical illnesses, the respiratory tract infections, diarrheas, and now the COVID. The gynecologists no more understand children. They are afraid to see children. And I think here that's why we as pediatric surgeons should shoulder this responsibility. And since we are dealing with children day in and out, dealing with the anorectal malformation cases, ambiguous genitalia cases, the Hirschsprung disease cases, we are conversant with the local anatomy and we can do the best repair than anybody else. And therefore, there has to be awareness about this entity in the pediatric surgeons of today's era. I have been involved with various prevention activities and lectures. I'm glad I'm invited here today in the Vadia PGCME to talk about this topic. Very sorry to say, but very few such lectures are conducted for doctors, though I have attended lectures for the police officials, teacher, and parents even. And why we need to do it? Because though we have the quality, though we are equipped to treat and repair these injuries, the pain that lasts, once the case happens, once abuse happens, the pain lasts for lifetime, and therefore we all must aim to prevent these instances in the first place. Though whenever the child comes to us, we should be equipped to treat them. And this should be done because every single child matters. Thank you for patient listening. If there are any questions, I would be glad to answer them.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to chair this session.
Shalika, I cannot hear you. I mean, I don't know if there is issue at my end or I don't know.
But I can hear you very nicely, Meenakshi. It was a beautiful presentation along with your photographs and pics and so much of work you are doing. I would, first of all, I would say good morning to everybody. Thanks to Dr. Pranya ma'am and team having given me this opportunity to chair this session of yours. It was lovely sharing with you your experience. And one thing I would like to add on for postgraduates must all be familiarized with colostomy and minor procedures, along with complete perineal tears repair to deal with sexual assaults. Apart from that, a long-term psychiatric opinion and consultation is also required because most of the children may suffer from anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses apart from physical ailments. Because health, I think it's a mental, physical, and it involves something mental as well as physical. Next thing, when the POSCO rule was a bit more stringent as compared to the Indian Penal Code rule. And initially, it was said that only girls are subject to sexual assault. But later, as you had rightly pointed out, in 2012 came the POSCO Act, and in which boys were equally susceptible, small boys were equally susceptible for sexual harassment and other cases. And otherwise, it was a wonderful lecture. I would thank for giving such a good.
Thank you so much. Actually, I could not hear you clearly what you were saying, but I gathered few things. So maybe whenever possible, next opportunity, we'll deal with this topic at great detail. Thank you so much.
And we had worked together 15 years back at Wadia. I hope you remember. We worked together. You used to stay in the same room, and I'm right now at Wadia. Okay. Thanks a lot, Meenakshi.
Okay, thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Meenakshi madam, for sensitizing the young pediatric surgeons for this important topic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Shalika Jaiswal, for chairing the session. And we're running behind the schedule, so I'll quickly move on to the next session, which is a talk on the pathology of mushroom babies. The speaker is Dr. Usha KV, who is professor in the Department of Pathology at St. John's, Bangalore. And the session will be chaired by Dr. Kanisha Department at AIMS, Bhubaneswar.
Dr. Kinney, we have made you the host. You can start your screen, share your screen.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. This is a very important talk that will follow now and is of particular interest to all practicing pediatric surgeons, especially in the context of problems that you face with Hirschsprung's disease. And so without much ado, we will move to the talk by Dr. Kinney.
Very good morning to all of you. I suppose I'm audible. Am I okay? Is my screen seen?
Yes.
Okay. So as I see that we are about half an hour late, nevertheless, let's stick to this topic of the approach to the pathology of Hirschsprung's disease, I've just made it simpler and practical because for half an hour that I could deal with, there's nothing better that I can do. So I just need to say that I have no conflict of interest. Now I take you to the roadmap that is of Hirschsprung's disease. What is that I'm going to say about on this in this half an hour is what, where, and why HD, because that makes the basis for how do we evaluate a case of Hirschsprung's disease. Number 2 is the diagnosis on biopsies. Number 3 is intraoperative consultations and see how we need to take its help. And of course, the third is the surgical pathology of resected specimens and what do we get, details to manage the patients further on, and the synoptic reporting. So with this in mind, I just want to bring awareness to a topic such as constipation in children. And we understand and we know that 85% of the children have constipation which is functional. Only about 15% is to a surgical cause which can be treated, and of which Hirschsprung's is only 8%. 8 cases, that is 5.8% or 6%. So our issue is, when do we identify and diagnose Hirschsprung's? Because very important so that we differentiate in a child who is constipated from a surgical cause, from a medical cause, and hence the treatment which varies between the two dramatically. So now coming to this slide, I just want to know, normally in a person, when he is taken in, yes, the foot reaches down up to the rectum and there is no obstruction whatsoever. And that is because of the intact vagal preganglionic fibers as well as the sympathetic postganglionic fibers which are in place. But what happens in a patient with Hirschsprung's? Yes, so the pool of the feces gets stagnated in the rectum, obviously because there is an obstruction lower down. Now, where do we attribute this to is the missing pump. So where is the pump being missed out? Is in these neural plexus, is the submucosal and the myric plexus. And what in these plexus? And we know it's all about the ganglion cells. So we see that these ganglion cells try to find their way between the two muscle layers in the propria, as well as they are in the submucous. But nevertheless, these two ganglion cell plexus are neatly interlinked with many neurons, so much so there are about 6 to 7 types of interneuron connections. They are the ascending, they are the excitatory, they are the descending, etc. And one is connected with the other, and so much so if you look at the villus tip, you see that there are so many fibrils that you see, and it's so rich, and that it innervates the mucosa, the goblet cells, the immune cells, the blood vessels. So it's such an intricate system, and the whole thing looks like a big meshwork, like a mosquito net, involving the entire GIT. No wonder that this ENS is called the second brain. Now to look at the development quickly, these ganglion cells are derived from the vagal neural crest cells from the somites S1 to S7, and they migrate down from the foregut and reach up to the hindgut caudal end. And they are supported by the sacral neural crest also at a much later latitude during the development, and they in fact support them to take care of the hindgut. And so when does all this happen? This starts in the 4th week and it's over by the 8th week of pregnancy. Thus to mean say that within the 2nd month of pregnancy, the migration has already occurred. And this is well shown what influences this migration. So to have this vagal neural crest derived cells to start with, we have the SOX10 and the ADRNB supporting them in all ways. and as they migrate down, they come to the foregut, and that is when the red gene comes into action. And they are continued to be supported by the SOX10 and the EDRNB, and they go down, and as they reach the cecal region, that is when there is so much of GDNF at this moment that it helps these enteric neural crest derived cells to proliferate, to differentiate. They form axons, they form synaptic connections, and they migrate down to the hindgut and go down to the hindgut. And mind you, at the hindgut, this forms the stimulus venues at the cecum for the sacral neural crest to send their impulse up, and they send their the neural crest from caudally to rostral. So they take care, they make sure that the entire GIT tract is well innervated with ganglion cells. Now, if there is any problem with the migration, proliferation, differentiation, axonogenesis, or any of the synaptic connections, that's when we have the problem of Hirschsprung's. So this Hirschsprung's disease, for its development, it needs several genes, of which the most important is the RET GDNFA signaling pathway, which takes to as 50 to 70% in its action, taking care of it, supported by the MASH1, the SOX10, the FOX2B, EDNRB, and the EDN3. So all have their own roles to play, making the smooth drive down of the ganglion cells to the distal rectum. For the normal motility of the anorectal, it's not only ENS, we have the smooth muscle to play a role, as well as the so-called the interstitial cells of Cachal, which are the pacemaker cells, which keep them all in good company. So, to quickly brief to ENS neurons, neural crests, precursors, colonize foregut, midgut, hindgut, and mind you, myelinic plexus is formed first, because the migration of the ganglion cells happen along the blood vessels in the mesentery and come up first, enter the myelinic plexus, and from there on circumferential, it goes up to involve the submucosal plexus. So now when there is an abnormality, that is when any of these connections are lost, we have increased parasympathetic, and that leads to acetylcholine, which is an excitatory factor, and that in turn tells us that is the acetylcholine esterase. So acetylcholine esterase acts as a surrogate marker for the absence of ganglion cells. Now, what happens when there is so much of excitation that is happening? The sympathetic system plays a down role, so there is decreased nitrous oxide, as a result NADPH. Now, in all these bargain, I just want to put a small note. When the muscle is excited, it is hypercontracted, much of calcium is used up, and at the same time, it forgets how to relax. So the aganglionic bowel lacks normal motility, so there's absolutely no peristalsis. It is contracted, and hence it forms the obstruction for which, resulting in the upstream bowel getting dilated, and the normal intersphincter relaxation is forgotten when there is a rectal stretch. And all this sort of stasis, obstruction results in HAEC, which you're all well aware of. So when we have Hirschsprung's this way, affecting, say, let's say, distal colon, we have the spasmodic contraction of the affected segment. And what does that result in? Marked dilatation of the proximal colon. So this was called as the congenital megacolon, but by Dr. Arnold Hirschsprung, way back in 1887, when he presented his paper in the Berlin Pediatric Society. At that moment, he thought, yes, the pathology was in this, and so much emphasis was given to the megacolon, but he didn't expect that the pathology was in the in the contracted segment. And this was later picked up. The significance of aganglionosis was not known for a very long time until 1948. And Swenson, the surgeon, first decided to prove, yes, that with the biopsy there is aganglionosis, and that is the basic problem in Hirschsprung's. So as we say, the crux of Hirschsprung's is there is absent ganglion cells. So mind you, this is a negative marker, something negative, but Paul gives for diagnostic. And because of that, we have the hypertrophic nerve fibers, which is of the parasympathetic nature. That results in increased acetylcholine esterase, which we try to demonstrate in biopsies using enzyme histochemistry. So the problem for this aganglionosis could be at the failure for migration, or failure to mature, or degeneration of the neural cells because there could be an altered microenvironment, or it failed to differentiate and mature. So as a result, you could have various phenotypes. So normally when you have ganglions from the top to the end, perfect, with all genes acting in place, or you could have distal rectum being aganglionic, then you could have short segment. And when it is higher up in the stomach and stops there, that is when you have total intestinal aganglionosis. And depending on the severity, you could have various types. So to involve rectosigmoid, which is the commonest, long segment is just about 15. Then you have the ultra short segment disease and variable length 5. Now coming to the severity of the disease, I have a small video to just show how this is the ultra short segment when it involves aganglionosis just above the dentate line, that is ultra short segment. Then we have the short segment involving only the distal rectum. The garden variety is the classical rectosigmoid, which is about 70 to 80%. And the long segment which goes up to splenic flexure, and this diagnosis is very important and emphasizes that you should have a biopsy from splenic flexure to prove that is ganglionic, aganglionic, to classically put the case is either long or short. Then we have the total colonic aganglionosis called for TCA, but it is considered a chapter or a subject by itself, varies a lot from the classical Hirschsprung's. And we have the total total intestinal aganglionosis, which is incompatible with life. So this baby with Hirschsprung's could have various ways. I'm not just going to say much about it. It could be the chronic, which is the most common form of manifestation. But I just want to emphasize on the acute presentation when he comes with perforation, necrotizing enterocolitis, and recurrent. This is when we shouldn't be missing out a diagnosis of Hirschsprung's in this patient. So how do we do that, and why is it important? So here is I have, it looks a bit busy slide, but this is the risk assessment, genetic assessment versus clinical risk assessment, and the way that this we look at the role of in the genetic, whether there is mutation in all these genes in the high risk, whereas in the low risk, there's no family history, no identifiable gene disease, it's a female child. Whereas in the high risk, it's an unexplained neonatal bowel perforation, marked abdominal bilious vomiting. All this tells you that the obstruction is very severe. And in these cases, that is when you have, it's reasonable to biopsy at-risk children who do not end up being diagnosed with Hirschsprung's, because this disorder is life-threatening and treatable, while the risk of the biopsy is low. So the management of Hirschsprung, how with this pathology can we add on to be very sure and have the final say on this, is with the histopathological examination. Pre-op would be to confirm diagnosis. Second would be intra-op level of diagnosis, that's with leveling biopsies. And of course, post-op confirm adequate pull-through. Now just to touch upon, so we have the rectal biopsy taken here. We have the multiple leveling biopsies at various levels of the proximal rectum and sigmoid and colon and further on to donut. These are the few which are well illustrated here. So we could have, one is the full thickness rectal biopsy where you just don't need any other measures, look at H&E and be done with it. Or the mucosal biopsies which have only the mucosa and the sufficient amount of submucosa for evaluation, and of course the seromuscular biopsy. Now I just want to say this tissue biopsies that you could have of many types depending on the type of surgery. It could be the 1 stage, that's the Soves, or the 2 or the 3 stage. But whatever be so, we start with the rectal biopsy. So just to give you a glimpse of the rectal wall, we have the mucosa, the submucosa, the two separated by the delicate muscle layer. And of course, we have the thick muscularis propria, inner and outer circular with myric plexus in between. The submucal plexus ganglion cells are very few and far apart. Now the question comes, when you take a biopsy of the mucosa, and this is where it's going to be, you may or may not sample the submucosal ganglion cells. So this is a longitudinal section of the rectal wall that I have shown you to very clearly depict that the distal part of the anorectal whatever is lined by the squamous epithelium, and before it continues further to form the classical intestinal epithelium, we have a transitional epithelium. But mind you that these are the nerve fibers, the extrinsic nerve fibers, which are always they innervate the distal anal canal, and they are quite thick, and a biopsy at this region may get this hypertrophic nerve bundles. But mind you, there are no ganglion cells in this small area when compared to the rest higher up, where they are neatly seen as submucosal and myric plexus. So now if we put that into perspective, this is the anal verge, and that differentiates between the rectum and the anal canal. We have the very important dentate line, which is the junction between the transitional epithelium of the anus with that of the classical mucosal producing epithelium. So this dentate line is very, very important. And why so? Is that your biopsies need to be taken higher or more proximal to dentate line and avoid this region, which is known as the physiological transition zone of hypoganglionosis. So never to take biopsy from here. That is why we don't take, and of course this is where the biopsies are normally taken. So now for Hirschsprung, now to compare the two. In Hirschsprung's no ganglion cells, these extrinsic parasympathetic put up the hypertrophic nerve bundles, which are well seen, and that is when this should not be mistaken with these nerve fibers lower down affecting the anorectal. So the physiological hypoganglions know no to biopsy, but in expert hands we can still go ahead and diagnose. So the biopsy site, as this picture really shows, it should be 2 to 3 centimeters above the pectinate or the dentate line, both are the same. Now, if you take a biopsy much higher, you could be missing out a diagnosis of Hirschsprung's because it could have been ganglionated there, and that this distal portion may not have been ganglionated, or this biopsy at this point is say too low, and you might call it Hirschsprung's just because you're not seeing ganglion cells. So these are the pitfalls that pathologists always take care to do it. So the diagnostic criteria always rule of thumb: absence of ganglion cells, presence of hypertrophic hypoplastic nerve bundles. But this constituent is highly variable. We have had biopsies where the whole biopsy is very silent with neither ganglion cells, neither nerve bundles. So how do we go about it? We'll talk about it later. So this is what we talk about the mucosal biopsy. This is what is normally taken ideally for a diagnosis of Hirschsprung's. And I always contemplate, yes, this is a biopsy which is very adequate, lot of mucosa which you always look for, which should be intact. And if it is denuded, we have usual problems because of the bowel washes. But even then, the expertise helps in picking up and making a diagnosis. But mind you, I want to say mucosal versus full thickness biopsy. There seems to be a debate. It is something saying, yeah, would you have a whole resected tumor mass or would you like true cut biopsies? Of course, it depends when you take it, right? So there's no way that we would debate on should I do mucosal or full thickness. Full thickness, I feel it's the day of minimal invasive techniques, and I'm sure you should do a lot about mucosal biopsies, get the best out of it, plan your surgery and do further on. And so the advantages of mucosal is, of course, outpatient procedure if suction, you have the gun and if all the facilities are in place, multiple samples can be taken, which you can't do in full thickness, and no scarring, of course, complications, them all, they are minimal or none. So the size of the mucosal biopsy is 2 millimeters. It's the smallest we have had, much smaller than that, like a small strip from a neonate. I suppose whatever is available is the best, and that has to be taken and done the needful. So what we normally look for, there should be sufficient submucosa. That's where you see the neural innervation. Now, this is how a classical biopsy. So if you have one like this with numerous nerve bundles, and of course, this was the only mucosal biopsy, no ganglion cells, you would still say it is suggestive and not unless otherwise proved, because in the deeper section, if you had found a ganglion cell, this is not going to be Hirschsprung's. So one important thing that I want to let you all know, that with H&E or mucosal biopsies, we are not right in calling Hirschsprung's. Possible normal innervation, saying yes, this is not Hirschsprung's because you have seen a ganglion cell. So the presence of one and more ganglion cell rules out Hirschsprung's. So the diagnosis of Hirschsprung's on mucosal biopsies, it means to say that it's a negative finding, and it is like looking for a needle in a haystack. You need to look at several sections, serial of them, 60 to 80, to confirm, or not even to confirm, to use the word absent ganglion cells if you are doing only H&E. Okay, that is the routine stain that is done in all histopathology labs. So if a pathologist tells you, I have called this Hirschsprung's on a mucosal biopsy, I'm sorry, I think it needs further confirmation with ancillary techniques. So in a normal mucosa, this is where you could see a very classical cluster of submucosal ganglion cells if you're lucky, but it is not the case all the time. Every biopsy is different from the other. Every child is different from the other when it comes to biopsy, so we can't have uniformity. So these are the beautiful ganglion cells which have large nucleus. So we could have denuded mucosa creating problems, lot of submucosal edema, keeping things all apart. The nerve fibers, they could be small, they could be hyperplastic, and they could be missed. And in the neonate, they could be looking like small lymphocytes and totally missed out. And then they say this biopsy is Hirschsprung's, when no, the child might be having normal number of ganglion cells. So it would have been wrongly called as Hirschsprung's disease. So this is how the ganglion cells look in a neonate, whereas in an adult, they are large and big. So the cells mature as the child develops and grows, they make you better. So with the technique of modified rapid ACHE that we have cut down the time. So in 30 minutes, we can give a diagnosis, what otherwise normally one would take 3 days to diagnose on mucosal biopsies with H&E and all, having cut 60 to 80 sections. So this is the ACHE stain that, or the acetylcholinesterase histochemistry. And so how do you send a biopsy, rectal biopsy? I would have it done send it in a plastic, sachet, Ziploc bag, and kept in ice if you want to do ACHE, because it needs frozen section cutting. Why? Because the enzyme gets denatured if you put it in formalin. So if you send us a specimen of a rectal biopsy in formalin, there's no way one can do an acetylcholinesterase histochemistry. So to tell you how to send the biopsy, if this is the biopsy, please wrap it up in saline soaked gauze to keep it moist, put it in a polythene cover all around it, and put it in a box which has ice cubes, and just send it across. It will last for about a day, so we can take it even after 24 hours, nothing, no matter. But is it ideal to send in glass bottles this way, marked labeled 1, 2, 3? I would say no. So because these glass bottles are so, you can't, the ice cubes have very little impact on the tissue inside. So never. So the tissue that is sent is kept on the ice cube, and we cut a frozen section. You mind you, the biopsies could be very, very small. This is when the expertise of the pathologist is required to orient in the right fashion to get the mucosa on the top and the submucosa below. If cut the other way, there would be no mucosa, and that would be difficult to evaluate acetylcholinesterase activity. So this is in a 3-day-old child. And this is the ACHE, which shows increased activity. It goes up into the mucosa like a branching pattern, very classic of Hirschsprung's. But in a child, you could have nothing going in the mucosa, all in the submucosa. This is where one could go wrong and call this normal and, looking for mucosa to show its response. But no, this is a classical HT in a newborn. Sometimes we get only mucosa and no submucosa, but still, it's mandatory that a frozen is cut and an ACH done. And if one gets to say a positive staining, yes, it is classical of HD, but negative staining does. So you have to hold back your diagnosis, ask for a repeat biopsy. So this was the days before, and now it is with just 2 sections of each that we need with acetylcholinesterase, which gives you a final 100% diagnosis, except for a few conditions which are far and far report, and I don't think one need to worry about it. Now, the question for you all is, in most cases, H&E is sufficient for a diagnosis of HD. So let me have your answer at the end of my talk. So, negative finding of or absent ganglion cells, positive finding of ACHE. This is how even in low-level biopsies, ACHE has worked. So there's a dictum in the books that I always see, don't take, and I also showed you a picture why one should not take above, below dentate line. But circumstances or situations that arise and we have received a biopsy, at least you should have some amount of rectal mucosa apart from the 10 to make a diagnosis. So we never, hold back diagnosis if things are all in place and we have a positive finding, but a negative finding demands for a repeat biopsy. So even here it's a low-level biopsy, positive ACHE. Good, fair enough to call it Hirschsprung's. But the problem with ACHE, I've told you, it should be processed within 24 hours. Enzyme is highly labile, experts to interpret because of, you need orientation, put things together. But what if mucosa biopsy sent in formalin? Is there any way out? Yes, I've told you that calcium gets used up when the muscle is excited. And that is when the calretinine, which is it's an immune marker which works on calcium channels on the intrinsic fibers, it shows stains the ganglion cells and humor when it is ganglionated. So in a normal, you have calretinine positive fibers. In Hirschsprung's, because of the hypercontractility, calcium being used, there are no fibers, so negative staining. So is calretinine the choice? Yes, I think so, and nothing more, because here I've shown you an example. We have in the normal ACHE is no fibers. Calretinine, you demonstrate intrinsic fibers and of course ganglion cells. Now we have the Hirschsprung where you have ACHE showing fibers whereas calretinine is negative. So it means to say that ACHE and calretinine are inversely proportional. Hope I am clear here and no doubt. So thus, ACHE is the gold standard but not suitable for formalin fixed tissue. Calretinine works on formalin fixed and is a negative marker for positive diagnosis, but it cannot be done on frozen section. So do we have another positive marker for formalin fixed? Because calretin is a negative, anything negative doesn't make it positive. So that is where the problem here is. So a whole lot of work has been done on immune markers with the nerve, and there are about something like 17. But so far the quest continues to get a ideal marker for ganglions, abnormal neural innervation. Though Dr. Raj Kapoor has come out with cholinase transporter, which is said to work just like acetylcholinesterase, but on formalin fixed tissue. But that antibody is not available in India, and those labs which have got it abroad, US, have not been able to get the same results as Dr. Kapoor. Now coming to leveling biopsies. So we get to have leveling biopsies unlike elsewhere.
Just a reminder.
It is time?
10 minutes.
Okay. I
Ma'am,
think
just
I
a
should
reminder,
be
you have
finished.
10 more minutes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I will finish by then.
Excuse me, ma'am, the time is over.
So if you could just speed it up, ma'am.
Yeah. So the leveling biopsies that we take are very important, that we attend to it from distal to proximal, and this is how to send in a very diagrammatic fashion to assist in reporting. Okay, so these biopsies can be conserved and put on the charts, all taken care of at one shot. But I think it's echoing somewhere. Should I continue? Okay, thank you. So the handling of minute biopsies, I won't go further on. And this is where the C-shaped seromuscular biopsy shows ganglion cells, and this is how it is normally done. But one thing to know is this biopsy is taken, the resection should be 5 centimeter proximal to it, and that proximal margin should also be sent for frozen section to look for the circumferential innervation, because this sector, what you have taken as leveling, cannot represent the entire circumference. And hence the 3-step approach to leveling biopsies identify the site proximal to the aganglionic segment, which is well ganglionated. Resection should be performed 5 centimeters proximal, which has ganglion cells, and do a frozen on the circumferential. So now the problems that one can face is non-availability of frozen, time required when the child is very sick on the table, inadequate. I suppose all these can be solved if only we have a good conversation with the pathologist. Now the pull-through procedures, as we have Svensson Druherman, the resected specimens to look at varies from each case to case. But the note on transition zone is that it's important because the ganglion cells which they migrate, which I'm going to show you, they don't go at one force at one level. There's always a wave front, and that is what makes it the leading edge for the ganglion cells. So the distinction between the ganglion and the aganglionic area is it is not a smooth line. So that is when this problem comes up and shows up on the donut that we look at. And this shows that the ganglion cells, one is here, but you see that there are no ganglion cells. So this is the wavefront leading edge problem in Hirschsprung's. And this is beautifully demonstrated in this time-lapse video microscopy, wherein you see that the migration of these ganglion cells, they are not uniform. See, one is leading ahead. So this must be kept in mind when you employ your biopsies. So the resected specimens that are pulled out, they are grossed in this fashion, I suppose, and taken into account both the ends and the margin. And to look for is the transition zone where you get one ganglion cell, many hypertrophic nerve bundles, and you do a quadrantic innervation studies on the whole margin circumferentially, either calling at full or 3/4 or half or quarter or 1/8 of the sector. So this frozen must be employed beyond doubt for all these proximal margins. So the report of the resected was you need to look a note on the transitions on what's the length and the surgical margin. So all variants of Hirschsprung, I just want to one word, the variants are all ganglion. So once you see a ganglion cell, it is not Hirschsprung's, but you can't rule out variants. And these are many of these and is a chapter by itself. So the poll question is H&E sufficient for HD diagnosis? No, mandates SHE and calretinib. Is frozen section needed at all after leveling biopsies? Yes, a must to avoid transition zone. Is biopsy at peritoneal reflection sufficient to rule out Hirschsprung's? It is. Never must take biopsy from the distal part of rectum. If all leveling biopsies are ganglionated, what next? So have we excluded Hirschsprung's? No, must take rectal biopsy to rule out or confirm Hirschsprung's. And lastly, I'll take it out simply said, yes, it's a fatal congenital birth defect where ENS is missing. It's non-Mendelian. Surgery bypassing the ganglionic bowel is life-saving, but is not always the cure as there are problems thereafter. And non-genetic factors have said to help in preventing Hirschsprung's. There are lots of studies. So we hope to have them and stem cell therapy in near future. So thank you very much. Sorry for the few minutes that I have taken extra. If you have any questions, I can answer you, or you can always mail me and reply you back. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the organizers
Rusha
to have
ma'am.
called me over.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Dr. Kanishka Das. Because we are running behind the schedule, we'll quickly move on.